Welcome to the Abstract Factory Design Pattern course. In this course, we'll learn everything you need to know about this design pattern. Even though the Abstract Factory Design Pattern may seem a bit complex in the beginning, it is actually pretty simple, and I'm sure that by the end of this course, then you'll have a crystal clear understanding of what this pattern is about, when to use it, and also when not to use it. It's important to note that in this course, then you have a prerequisite of watching the factory method design pattern course. So if you didn't watch it yet, then pause this video now, watch that, and then come back and watch this course. So without further ado, let's jump right in and talk about the family of factory design patterns and then dive into the abstract factory design pattern. So overall, we have three factories or factory patterns in the factory family. We have the simple factory, the factory method, and the abstract factory pattern. Now, the simple factory pattern, like we said, is just a method, usually inside its own class called a factory, in which we encapsulate the logic of creating an object. So over here, for example, we have the password factory and the create password. This encapsulates the logic of creating the password. Now, this is great if over here you have complex logic, or if you have a non-trivial creation of an object in various places across your application, then it may make sense to centralize it and encapsulate that in one place. So basically what we're doing is we're moving the instantiation logic from being inline where it's used to being in another location altogether. That way it's encapsulated, it's hidden away from the caller, plus it's centralized. So if it's needed for multiple places, then you can go ahead and use the exact same logic, which means that as you need to change the behavior, then also you need to change it only in one place. Next, we have the factory method pattern, in which what we're doing is we're defining an interface to create an object. And when we're saying interface, we're not talking about interface as in programming, but just an interface as something we're interacting with. So we're defining the interface for creating an object, and this goes ahead and creates the object. Now, the beauty about this pattern is that the caller doesn't care about the concrete types, not of the creator, the one who creates the object, and not about the type of the product. It only cares about the factory method in the creator and the product base class or interface that it needs to use. So what we have is, instead of using the concrete product inline, so over here, the client is tied directly to the concrete product type. Instead of this, what we have is the client is only dependent on these abstract classes or interfaces, which contain what it logically wants to do, and the creation logic and everything is delegated and deferred to the subclasses, which decide eventually what concrete product to actually create. Now, I want to do also another quick refresher on the class diagram of the factory method. So again, we have the client. The client in the end wants to have some concrete product. Now, the client doesn't necessarily care about the specific concrete product that it uses. Instead, it cares about the methods and properties that the product has. The client, to get hold of this product, goes ahead and uses the create product method in the creator. The actual implementation sits in the concrete creators, and each one of these goes ahead and creates whatever concrete product that it wants. And this way we have the client completely decoupled from the creation logic, from the instantiation logic, and this is delegated to these over here. So that's a quick refresher on the simple factory and the factory method patterns that are a prerequisite for this course, just in case you didn't come directly from that course. Now let's go ahead and talk about the abstract factory pattern that builds upon the factory method pattern. So let's start talking about the abstract factory pattern. First of all, similar to the factory method pattern, this is also a creational pattern. What we're doing is we're defining a technique, a mechanism to create an object, and because that is the case, then it falls under the grouping or the classification of the creational patterns. Now let's talk about the actual definition from the Gang of Four book. So we're saying the abstract factory pattern provides an interface for creating not just one product or not just one object, but families of related or dependent objects. So the abstract factory pattern, unlike the factory method pattern, we aren't just trying to create one product, but we're trying to create multiple different products that are somehow dependent on one another. They're related to one another. They need to be from one family. And this pattern provides a way to do this without specifying their concrete classes. So I want to go ahead and visualize this a bit before we go ahead and build the class diagram together, which will definitely help drive this home. So we have the client, and the client in the end cares about a family of products. Now, it doesn't matter to the client if it's this family of products or this family of products. All it cares about is that it has the underlying products that it can work with. Now, the client, it's important for them not to have a mixing between the families of products. Meaning that if this entire family is A and this entire family is B, then it's important for the client not to mix A products with B products. Now, it doesn't matter what the concrete instance is, but it does matter to the client that it's part of the same grouping. What this pattern gives us is a way to go ahead and use some factory. This will be, for example, factory B, and this will be, for example, factory A. The client will go ahead and use either only factory A or only factory B to go ahead and create the underlying products that it wants. Following this pattern, the client can be confident that if they use factory B, then factory B will only create products from family B. If the client uses factory A, then it knows it'll only get products from family A. Now, there are many examples for when this pattern makes sense, and we'll talk about them throughout the course. Plus, we'll look at a practical example. But just the most common example when teaching this design pattern is that let's imagine that the products over here are UI elements for macOS, and over here we have UI components for Windows. It makes sense that the client will work in the abstract level of just having, for example, some button, but it doesn't care if the button belongs to macOS or Windows. It just wants to work with the idea of a button. But to ensure that it's using only macOS buttons, then it'll go ahead and use the factory that creates macOS specific UI elements. Likewise, if it's using Windows, then it'll use factory B, and then it knows it's only creating Windows UI elements. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense for what is the abstract factory pattern. But in any case, we'll now build the class diagram. We'll talk a bit more about examples, and hopefully by the end of this section, even before we start implementing this in code, then you'll have a clear understanding of what this pattern is all about. One last thing I want to say before we build the class diagram is that if we compare this to the factory method pattern, then what the factory method pattern gives us is the idea of the client using either factory A or factory B, and each one of the factories creates the corresponding underlying product. So this, if we had only this without the two other products in each family, then what this is the factory method pattern. We have the client using factory A or factory B, and each one creates its corresponding underlying product. Now, the client, to interact with the factory, then of course it doesn't use directly the concrete product, but instead it uses some factory base class contains the create product method, right? So this is the pattern that we just talked about, where the client interacts with the factory base, but behind the scenes in runtime, of course, you have a concrete instance. This concrete instance will be either this or this, and it'll go ahead and create the underlying product. What the abstract factory pattern gives us is another step on top of that, where if you need to create groups of related objects, then the factory doesn't have only one method, but it has several methods, and each one of the factory goes ahead and implements the several methods. That way, the factory A doesn't know only how to create this product, but it knows how to create all three products, and likewise for factory B. So that's just a freestyle explanation of what the abstract factory pattern is. Now let's go ahead and build the actual class diagram.